Throughout history, since the earliest times, many types of historical shield have had bosses on them. The boss is this dome section which goes in front of your hand, like on this reproduction Roman scutum. And they follow through all the way through into the Middle Ages with things like this Viking era shield here. So it should be self-evident why they have bosses on them, because you have a grip on the back, your hand goes into the shield, and the boss is on the front to protect your hand. So the question then follows, why did some other later periods of shield, which were strapped, where your arm goes up the back and is held by various strap arrangements, why did many of those have bosses attached to them? I'm going to give you 4 reasons why I think you might want to attach a boss onto a strap gripped shield. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm coming here to you today thanks to William of Normandy. So the Normans famously used these kite type shields, and in fact they were actually also used, although they were sometimes referred to as Norman shields, these were also used by Scandinavians, Norse, Danish, and also Anglo-Saxons and various other people, Spanish and Northern Italians and various others at this time. So this was a type of shield which became really popular. Actually started out in the 10th century, but most people think of it as an 11th century thing, because this is really the period when the round boss grip shield really in most places got supplanted by the strap shield. Now, we have looked in previous videos why that change from boss gripped to strapped might have happened. We're not going to deal with that here, but one of the things which I get questioned on when I show this Norman shield and another shield we're going to look at in a second is why would they have bosses on them? Because you're not gripping inside the boss. As mentioned in application to this Roman shield, and incidentally you'll notice the grip is horizontal on a Roman shield, which is quite unusual. Usually they're vertical on most other boss grip shields, although obviously you can turn them around. So with the circular shield, is it horizontal, is it vertical? It depends which way you hold your hand. But it's obvious why those have got bosses on them, because your hand goes into, sticks through in a way, the shield board, and so you need the buckler essentially, we'll talk about bucklers in a second, on the outside to protect the hand. But why would you want a boss on this type of shield? Well, I was pondering this and I've come up with 4, I think, pretty plausible reasons. So reason number 1 really applies to these Norman shields, but not necessarily to the later examples, which we'll look at in a second. And that is tradition. So you've got to imagine a world where literally for hundreds of years, in some places thousands of years, people have been using boss gripped shields, okay? And suddenly you're told, oh, well, the new latest thing that we need to be using in the army is this type of strap shield. And everyone's like, wow, that's crazy. If you look at somewhere like Britain, for example, the ancient Britons had various types of shield over the years, but predominantly they were centre gripped as far as we know. Now that's not to say this is purely a time period thing, because in fact if we go back to the ancient Greeks, for example, the hoplites and various other people actually in history, they did have strapped shields earlier on. But in Britain, for example, pretty much everyone had had boss grip shields for hundreds and hundreds of years and then moved to strap shields. Now if you're living in that environment, you have a concept of what a shield is. A shield is something made of wood, covered with leather and canvas and other things like this, and it's made in a certain way by shield makers who themselves are, you know, it's not just the buyers who are subject to tradition and kind of social conventions, but also the makers. And so I think a very real first reason for why many of these early strap shields had a boss on them was simply because they had the idea that shields have bosses on them, so we'll keep putting bosses on them even though the boss isn't really doing anything anymore. And you have to bear in mind as well that in a sort of late Anglo-Saxon society, early Norman society, it's entirely possible there were people whose entire job was making these bosses and they wanted to stay in business. Maybe they had agreement with the people that made the shield boards, and they kept doing it, and they made up some reason for why it was a good idea to have them on there so that they could stay in business making them. That's just conjecture, but it's possible. We see that with later guild systems in later medieval periods and manufacturing of certain things which probably aren't really needed anymore. Anyway, so the first rule is, or the first suggestion is, tradition, because shields have bosses, so they just kept doing it. Now, explanation number 2 is for reinforcement. Now this actually goes for all shields. We'll come back to the strapped shield in a second. I'll just carefully put this down somewhere it's not going to fall over. If we go to this type of shield, now it's interesting to note that some of the kind of lower status and also earlier period boss grip shields don't actually have an iron boss, sometimes known in antiquarian works as a umbo writings, you might find that referred to. They actually have wooden ones, or sometimes made of other materials. So this thing has to project in order to cover the hand and protect the hand, but it doesn't have to be made of iron. But when they could make them of iron, when there was enough iron available or when people could afford it, they made them of iron. Why? Because it's stronger. It's also less bulky as well than something like wood. So this is, even on a boss grip shield, not just a protector for the hand, and we do sometimes see references where the whole rest of the shield is broken apart, chopped apart, split. Remember, this would have been individual boards, so they would have been split. It would have been covered back and front. This isn't completely authentic, this one. These days people tend to use plywood, which is much stronger, but with original wood planks it would be more likely to split and break, and we find references to this in the sagas, for example, the Norse sagas. But you would be left with this boss, and because the grip is attached to the boss, you would still have what's essentially a buckler. Now, bucklers are these. They're a late medieval type of shield. We'll come back to those in a second. But the buckler almost certainly originally derives from the shield boss, and it just gets a bit bigger and is used by itself. So the great thing about these is the iron boss in the middle and the grip attached to it are really the strongest parts of the whole shield. So that will outlast the rest of the shield. So this is reinforcement already. Now, if we come to the flatter type of shield, which is held against the arm, very obviously, no matter what angle you hold this shield at, a lot of things will hit the middle, whether it's arrows, spears, swords, axes, maces, whatever. And so having something made of iron in the middle, and now I'll show you a later version. So this is kind of 15th century style, because they did add bosses onto these as well. Then that is great reinforcement on the weakest and most vulnerable part of the shield that also happens to be in front of your arm. And something that's been noted, particularly, for example, in Todd's workshop, my friend, doing tests with arrows, but also with things like peeler and spears and stuff that I've done as well, is that very often a shield or a spear or an arrow will go through the shield and could impale the arm, could injure the hand or the arm, which is clearly you don't want. So having that in the front, very valuable reinforcement. So second reason, probably the most obvious, just to reinforce the front of the shield. Now the second reason is something that we've actually discovered in use, whether it's HEMA, living history, reenactment, even LARP. We have found that shields which have projections on the front like this assist in binding. Now what's binding? If you're a HEMA practitioner, you'll instantly know what I'm talking about. The problem with shields, one of the problems with shields can be that weapons slide off them, and this is particularly a problem with things like spears that are moving in a straight line and they are a long pole. Now very clearly, as you know, things like swords and axes are great in close combat, particularly if you're wearing armour and the opponents are wearing armour, but predominantly across history the most common weapon was the spear. Now when someone puts a spear at you, it's fine, yes, or I will defend it with my shield, great. But the problem is with a flat surface, the spear can slide up and down, which means it can slide off the top and catch you in the face, it can slide off the bottom and catch you in the crotch or the legs. If you have something on the front, either above or below, it enables you to bind against that shaft and either push it down, push it up, or whatever. It just means a control point. So, and this would work against swords as well. So a sword that's swung down at your head, if you block here with your shield, it will come down here and hit and stop on the boss. Why do you want that? Well, it enables you to control the person's sword while you come in with your own attack. It means it's not going to slide down and come under and get you in the leg, that kind of stuff. So binding, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, is advantageous. So much so that when we come to bucklers again, we actually find that, particularly in the age of the rapier and the side sword, bucklers like these start to be enhanced with binding features. Sometimes they have a little spike on the front, sometimes they have projections or bars around the edges designed to catch and control an opponent's blade, a bit like how a left-hand dagger does, used in conjunction with a rapier. So the second reason why these bosses I think would be really good, and this does incidentally also apply even to the Norman kite shield over here, is because it gives you a binding point, a controlling point, and of course people who came from the centre gripped Viking era, Anglo-Saxon, Frankish style centre gripped shields were already familiar with that benefit, because that is a benefit of boss gripped shields as well, even going all the way back to Roman and Celtic and everything else shields that have a boss on the front. So the boss is very useful for binding. Now the final reason is sort of related to the previous two, which was reinforcement and binding, but it's a slightly different concept, and that is deflection. So this is the fourth and final reason I'm giving for why people with strapped shields, with N-arms as they're sometimes called, with strapped shields might add a boss onto the front, and that is deflection. Now notice that the shape of bosses, particularly these later kind of pointy ones that you see on 15th century shields, which on the surface of it seems a strange period to add bosses onto shields, but it did happen in the 15th and 16th century. If you think about things being shot at you, could be thrust at you as well, could be a spear or, you know, a halberd tip or anything like this, but predominantly shot at you, crossbow bolts and arrows. Now something we found in tests, if I just take this off my arm, something we found in tests is that when arrows and spears come in at an angle, they do sometimes glance off. So they might stick in the wood, but even if they stick in the wood, the angulation means the shaft then snaps or twists or comes out again. The place that they really get stuck in is down this center line down here. Now, we've already talked about reinforcement, but if you think about the shape of the boss, what this also achieves is if it comes in here and hits any part of that boss, it is going to deflect off and mean that when it hits the final shield, it will be at an angle. Now, again, as been shown in the arrows versus armor test that my friend Todd has done, when arrows hit with any sort of angle on them, it's not good for penetration, okay? For something to penetrate, it wants to be straight on. If there is any angle on the shaft as it hits the target, it tends to do this, okay? And tends to either snap the head off or just slap the target. It has to be straight on. So anything that deflects in the middle is advantageous. Not only does it protect your arm better and deflects away from where your arm is, but it also protects the entire shield and reduces the chances of penetration of the shield board. So there we go, the four main reasons that I can think of. Can you think of others? There might be others that you can think of, and I'd be very interested to read those down in the comments. But I think the four headline ones are tradition, reinforcement, binding against opposing weapons, and deflection. Anyway, I hope to see you down in the comments down below. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and I will be again next time. I hope I see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.